Do you really think you belong here? The words echoed sharply off the cold, gray walls of the precinct hallway, carrying a weight that made the air seem heavier. Maya Williams paused mid-step, her backpack straps tight against her shoulders, and the crisp morning light from the narrow windows caught the determined glint in her eyes. The tiles beneath her polished shoes reflected the fluorescent glow, stretching the shadows of the officers looming ahead. Sergeant Nolan, his uniform starched and creased, leaned casually against the locker banks with a smirk that suggested both amusement and authority. Around him, a pair of younger officers chuckled quietly, their whispers bouncing off the walls like soft percussion. Maya tightened her grip on the file folder she carried, the papers inside meticulously organized, annotated with notes only she could understand. She had been here before, quietly observing, learning the rhythm of the building, the cadence of their speech, the subtle hierarchies that dictated who commanded respect and who was dismissed. Today, however, she could no longer be invisible. Her heels clicked in steady rhythm as she walked past the group, the sounds slicing through the murmurs, drawing their attention like a magnet. One officer stepped forward, blocking her path with a calculated lean, his badge catching the light, glinting briefly. "Hold on, sweetheart. Where do you think you're rushing off to?" His tone carried a mixture of condescension and curiosity, as if he were testing her resolve. Maya exhaled slowly, allowing the tension in her shoulders to settle, then lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. The hallway fell into an almost eerie silence, the distant hum of the ventilation system the only background noise. In that silence, every tiny motion became amplified, the flicker of a fluorescent bulb, the subtle shift of weight from one boot to another, the quiet shuffle of papers in her folder. Maya's eyes scanned the faces before her, noting the raised eyebrows, the skeptical glances, the faint smirk of someone who assumed dominance merely by position. She adjusted the strap of her backpack, the motion deliberate and calm, and then, without breaking eye contact, she took a small step to the side, sliding past the officer with a controlled grace that betrayed both her confidence and awareness of the space. The murmurs of disbelief rose again, a low ripple through the line of officers as if a stone had been dropped into still water. Maya's lips pressed into a thin line, her jaw steady, yet there was a spark behind her eyes that no one could misread, a quiet insistence that she belonged not by favor, but by the merit of her mind and the precision of her observation. The camera of perception lingered on her face, catching the subtle tension in her cheeks, the slight flare of her nostrils as she inhaled deeply, and the unyielding set of her shoulders. Time seemed to stretch in that moment, elongating the seconds into a measured sequence where every glance, every shift of stance, spoke louder than words. Sergeant Nolan exhaled audibly, a sound that carried more than irritation, a mixture of surprise and reevaluation, and for a brief instant, the hierarchy that had seemed so absolute wavered. Maya continued walking, each step deliberate, her presence asserting itself in a space that had been designed to intimidate, but where she now carved a path with nothing more than poise, observation, and the unshakable assertion of self. The fluorescent light flickered overhead, casting brief, fragmented shadows that danced across the linoleum, echoing the quiet tension in the room. Her gaze remained fixed straight ahead, yet she was acutely aware of the subtle movements behind her, the barely perceptible shift of weight, the hand lingering near a belt, the soft click of polished shoes responding instinctively to her intrusion. In that elongated pause, the hallway itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see whether the challenge would escalate, whether the subtle assertion of a young woman in a place that underestimated her would provoke a reaction or be absorbed into the humdrum of routine authority. And in that measured silence, Maya's determination radiated not as a demand, but as an undeniable truth that she would not be dismissed, that her intellect, her preparation, and her presence were enough to stand against the assumed dominance of those who had long believed they were untouchable, and for the briefest moment, the air shifted, the balance of power subtly but unmistakably altered, all without a word of aggression, all through the quiet strength of conviction alone. The early morning sun filtered through the narrow blinds of Maya Williams' small apartment, casting slanted shadows across the worn hardwood floors and highlighting the neat stacks of papers and notebooks that lined the corner desk. Maya moved quietly, her bare feet making soft contact with the floor as she retrieved a fresh notebook from the shelf, its cover slightly frayed from frequent use. Her eyes scanned the morning headlines on the tablet she had set on the counter, but her focus quickly returned to the folders on the table. Each document had been meticulously organized the night before, notes carefully aligned with colored tabs marking critical sections. Maya had always approached challenges with methodical precision, a trait inherited from her mother who worked long hours as a clerk at the courthouse, instilling in her the discipline to notice details others might overlook. The apartment smelled faintly of brewed coffee and the lingering scent of vanilla from the candle she had lit the evening prior, creating a quiet sanctuary before the chaos of the day. Her reflection in the window revealed a young woman with a steady gaze, dark eyes alert, framed by a few strands of hair that had escaped the simple braid she wore. Maya adjusted her backpack, checking that the straps were secure, and ran her fingers briefly over the leather cover of her folder, a tactile reassurance that her plans were intact. She had mapped out her route to the precinct, noting the time it would take to walk from the subway station and the sequence of stairwells and hallways that would bring her to the officers she would meet. Every step was calculated, not to avoid confrontation, but to ensure that she was fully aware of her surroundings and prepared to engage when necessary. Her mind wandered briefly to her schooling, recalling hours spent in the local library, poring over case studies, municipal codes, and legal briefs, cultivating a knowledge that was both practical and precise. The light in the kitchen reflected softly off the polished silver of her coffee mug, steam curling upward, mimicking the deliberate movements of her hands as she organized pens and markers into neat holders. Maya exhaled, allowing herself a moment of composure, acknowledging the nervous energy that accompanied entering a space where she would be underestimated simply by her age, her stature, and the color of her skin. Yet there was no fear in her posture, only focus and the quiet assertion of competence. She had faced skepticism before, in classrooms, in local offices, and in fleeting encounters with authority figures who assumed dismissal was automatic. Today, however, her preparation was her ally, the hours of study, observation, and careful practice crystallizing into a presence that commanded attention without arrogance. The backpack weighed slightly against her back, grounding her, reminding her of the purpose she carried with every step, the responsibility of knowledge wielded wisely. Maya left the apartment, stepping into the brisk morning air, inhaling deeply as the city stirred around her. Sidewalks rattled with the clatter of early commuters, distant sirens punctuated the ambient hum, and the metallic scent of the subway vents mingled with the freshness of newly cut grass from a nearby park. Each footfall was deliberate, a quiet declaration of readiness, the echo of her shoes a rhythmic counterpoint to the rising pulse of the city. As she approached the precinct, the building loomed with imposing steel and glass, the early light bouncing off the surface in sharp reflections, a physical manifestation of the authority it contained. Maya's eyes flicked to the badge of the officer on the corner, noting posture, angle, the casual confidence with which he surveyed the street, and she adjusted her stride to maintain calm composure. She entered the vestibule, the automatic doors whispering open and closed behind her, and felt the subtle shift in air pressure, the cool chill mingling with the faint scent of cleaning solution, a familiar environment she had studied from afar. Her gaze moved to the layout of the lobby, the arrangement of desks, the placement of surveillance cameras, and the flow of officers moving between assignments, all catalogued in her mind as she prepared for the engagement ahead. Maya's hands rested briefly on the strap of her folder, fingertips brushing the textured cover, a small grounding ritual, before she lifted her head and walked with measured pace toward the corridor that would lead her to the officers she had been observing for weeks, ready to navigate the space with awareness, intelligence, and the quiet strength that had brought her this far. The corridor opened up into a larger common area where the early morning light filtered through tall, narrow windows, scattering across the polished floors in sharp, geometric patterns. Officers moved with purposeful precision, their steps echoing softly against the walls, creating a rhythm that mingled with the faint hum of the ventilation system and the distant clatter of keys and phones at the front desks. Sergeant Nolan stood near the center of the space, his arms crossed, surveying the officers around him with an air of controlled authority, every movement deliberate and measured. His badge caught the sunlight, glinting briefly, a quiet reminder of the institutional power he represented. The younger officers shifted in his presence, some straightening their posture, others lowering their eyes, acknowledging a hierarchy that Maya had observed but not yet engaged with directly. She moved slowly, every step deliberate, the polished soles of her shoes clicking in soft contrast to the low murmur of conversations, the subtle movement of paper being sorted, the occasional squeak of a rolling chair. Maya's gaze swept across the room, noting who was speaking to whom, the direction of attention, the subtle nods of compliance that passed between officers, the slight hesitations that suggested uncertainty beneath the surface of confidence. She approached the cluster of officers at the far end, their postures relaxed, smiles faintly smug, hands resting casually on belts and counters, the physical embodiment of self-assurance and dominance. A young officer glanced up, eyebrows raised slightly, a silent challenge in his glance, testing her composure, measuring whether she would flinch or respond. Maya met his eyes, steady, unwavering, a quiet confidence radiating from her stance, the weight of her preparedness and intellect filling the space between them more powerfully than any words could. She positioned herself just within view, adjusting her grip on the folder, aligning it with the edge of the countertop, a physical gesture of readiness that also served to assert her presence without confrontation. The room seemed to subtly shift, the energy bending toward her as curiosity and attention pulled in the space, each officer now aware of her deliberate entrance. Sergeant Nolan tilted his head, eyes narrowing ever so slightly, lips pressed together, an almost imperceptible evaluation passing across his features as he recognized the poise and quiet determination in the young woman standing in the midst of a space designed to intimidate. Maya took another measured step, the slight rustle of her papers the only audible indication of movement, her mind cataloging details with meticulous attention, the direction of the sunlight, the spacing between desks, the positions of each officer, their posture, their hand movements, their unspoken signals. Every subtle cue was noted, every micro-expression observed, the environment analyzed in real time, creating a mental map that allowed her to navigate the space with both awareness and strategic patience. Her shoulders remained relaxed, her breath steady, yet there was a tension in her hands that spoke to readiness, anticipation, and focus. She paused briefly near a locker bank, her reflection caught in the polished metal surface, revealing a face calm yet alert, eyes bright with awareness, every feature set in a manner that communicated quiet authority and preparation. The room held its rhythm, the faint hum of electronics, the shuffle of papers, the soft murmur of early morning exchanges, all serving as a backdrop to her poised presence, a stark contrast that drew subtle attention and created a dynamic of observation and quiet command. Maya's path through the space was deliberate, weaving through the officers with an ease born of preparation, every glance a calculated assessment, every step a measure of her growing influence in a space that had once seemed purely the domain of those she observed, now subtly acknowledging her presence, her mind fully engaged, analyzing, adapting, and preparing for the moments ahead when observation would give way to deliberate action. As Maya reached the cluster of officers, she took a deep breath, centering herself in the midst of the subtle swirl of authority and expectation that filled the space. Her fingers lingered briefly over the edge of her folder, the crisp corners aligning with the polished lines of the counter she approached, a quiet anchor against the subtle tension that radiated from the group. Sergeant Nolan's eyes followed her movements, a faint tightening around the brows suggesting recognition of her purposeful presence, the confidence she carried without audacity. Maya's gaze swept the officers, noting the slight lean of one against the wall, the crossed arms of another, the soft shifting of feet as they acknowledged her approach without speaking. Her voice, calm yet firm, broke the silence with a measured statement. This section in the report contains discrepancies that could impact departmental procedure and liability if not addressed accurately. The words floated through the air, precise and deliberate, carrying a weight that was immediately felt, not as a threat but as a carefully reasoned observation. Heads turned subtly, some raised eyebrows betraying curiosity, others narrowing eyes and skepticism. Maya adjusted the strap of her backpack, the motion minimal but deliberate, a signal of control and focus, and then moved a step closer to the counter, ensuring that her presence was seen and acknowledged without provoking confrontation. Sergeant Nolan tilted his head, lips pressing together briefly, a pause in his otherwise fluid movement, as if weighing her statement against the routine authority that governed the precinct. The younger officers glanced at one another, the murmurs stifled by the clarity of her presentation, the organized sequence of her notes, the logical progression of her observations. Maya opened the folder slowly, allowing the soft rustle of the papers to punctuate her next words, detailing each point with calm clarity, her tone measured, the cadence deliberate, emphasizing accuracy, procedure, and attention to detail. The subtle change in the room was palpable, a shift from assumption to awareness, as the officers began to reassess not only the content of her words but the presence and competence of the young woman standing before them. Her eyes scanned the room continuously, noting micro-expressions, the slight shift of a shoulder, the faint nod of an eyebrow, cataloging the human reactions as carefully as the details in her documents. Each pause she took was measured, not hesitation but a deliberate space that allowed her reasoning to resonate, her understanding of the space and the dynamics within it reinforcing the subtle authority she projected. The fluorescent light above flickered briefly, casting angular reflections across the polished surfaces, highlighting the contrast between the rigid lines of uniforms and the poised form of Maya, a humanizing tension that drew attention without raising voices. She finished her initial points and stepped back slightly, posture erect, shoulders squared, eyes steady, creating a visual cue that her contribution was complete and intentionally framed. Sergeant Nolan exhaled softly, the sound subtle but carrying a shift in acknowledgement, a pause that indicated the room was recalibrating its perception of hierarchy and competence. The air, previously filled with subdued chatter and mechanical hums, now carried the quiet weight of reassessment, a recognition that Maya's action was deliberate, informed, and impactful, setting the stage for what would follow next in the controlled dynamics of the precinct, a space where observation, preparedness, and clarity could subtly yet profoundly influence the established order. The subtle tension in the precinct heightened as a ripple of murmured voices traveled through the clustered officers, a quiet wave of skepticism and doubt threading its way between the polished floors and the angular shadows cast by the morning light. Sergeant Nolan's eyes narrowed, a slow, deliberate motion as he considered Maya's points, the set of her shoulders, the calm yet unwavering tone that had carried her words clearly across the space. One of the younger officers, a man with a neatly pressed uniform and a smirk that suggested he assumed superiority by default, leaned forward slightly, his fingers brushing the edge of the counter in a gesture of mild exasperation, as if daring her to step out of line or falter. The collective expectation hung in the air, a silent challenge that filled the space with a quiet charge, palpable without a single raised voice. Maya adjusted her stance slightly, shifting the weight evenly between her feet, her gaze sweeping the room with keen awareness, reading micro-expressions, noting the brief flicker of doubt, the subtle tilting of heads, the nearly imperceptible straightening of posture as the officers absorbed the weight of her observations. Her voice, calm but clear, continued to articulate each detail, each discrepancy, with measured precision, ensuring that every word carried weight, that each sentence reinforced her command of the information and her presence in the room. The younger officer straightened abruptly, his smirk faltering for the briefest instant, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty, a recognition that the calculated preparation and unwavering focus of the young woman before him could not be easily dismissed or overlooked. Sergeant Nolan's lips pressed together in a thin line, the faintest exhale marking a moment of pause as he processed both the content of her words and the manner in which they were delivered, a simultaneous assessment of competence and poise that shifted the room's energy subtly but unmistakably. Maya's fingers traced lightly along the edge of the folder, a motion so minimal it seemed almost unconscious, yet it drew the eye, a visual punctuation to the reasoned statements she continued to present with deliberate clarity. The low hum of fluorescent lights above, the distant clatter of equipment and keys, even the faint scrape of shoes on linoleum, all seemed to fall into rhythm with the cadence of her explanations, creating a dynamic where her presence and prepared articulation imposed attention without coercion. The smirk returned briefly to the younger officer's face, quickly suppressed by the realization that Maya's calm precision and the depth of her awareness could not be countered by posture alone. Another officer shifted slightly, the faint rustle of a paper stack emphasizing the tension as he leaned over to glimpse her documents, eyes widening subtly as he recognized points he had not considered. Time seemed to elongate, each second stretching to allow the full impact of her presence, the unspoken authority that knowledge and meticulous preparation granted, to register within the space. Maya held her position, the folder in her hands, her gaze steady, unwavering, embodying both patience and control, projecting a quiet strength that demanded reconsideration of assumptions, challenging the default hierarchy and subtly reshaping the dynamics in the precinct. The sunlight streaming through the windows caught the edges of her hair and the surface of her folder, highlighting the deliberate calm with which she stood, a stark contrast to the previously unchallenged confidence of the officers around her, and as she concluded her points, a tense silence settled over the space, signaling a collective pause, a moment of internal reckoning where authority, observation, and meticulous attention collided, leaving an almost tangible expectation hanging in the air, as every officer present became acutely aware of the precision, preparation, and unflinching focus of the young woman before them. The room settled into a calm pause, the hum of the fluorescent lights above mingling with the soft, measured breathing of Maya as she held her position, the folder resting lightly in her hands. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting elongated, angular patterns across the polished floors, illuminating the subtle textures of her clothing and the determined set of her shoulders. Maya allowed herself a moment to inhale deeply, the crisp morning air filtered through the building's ventilation system filling her lungs, steadying her heartbeat and sharpening her awareness of the space around her. She let her gaze travel slowly across the officers, noting the softened lines in their faces, the tentative straightening of posture, the quick exchange of glances that betrayed an acknowledgement of her clarity and composure. Every micro-expression was catalogued in her mind, each subtle shift of attention, a nod, a lifted eyebrow, a hand moving slightly closer to a clipboard or badge, contributing to a tapestry of understanding that gave her both insight and quiet control over the dynamic in the room. Her fingers traced lightly along the edge of her folder again, the tactile motion grounding her as she exhaled a second time, allowing the silent gravity of her presence to permeate the space without a single word. The atmosphere had changed. The prior rhythm of confidence and assumed dominance was tempered now by curiosity and a restrained attentiveness that had been absent only moments before. Maya's eyes reflected the sunlight in small, flickering glimmers as she remained perfectly still, her body language radiating poise and silent determination, a quiet insistence that her observations and insights were both valid and essential. She allowed the slight pause to linger, letting it serve as a silent punctuation between her deliberate, calculated steps and the attention her meticulous preparation commanded. The officers, previously brimming with casual certainty, now appeared subtly hesitant, the cadence of their movements slightly disrupted, a recognition that the flow of authority in this space was no longer absolute, that her calm, precise engagement had shifted the balance without confrontation or raised voices. Maya's stance remained relaxed but firm, each breath measured, each eye contact intentional, reinforcing the quiet command of her presence. The reflective surfaces around the room, from the polished floors to the glinting badges and metal edges of filing cabinets, caught fragmented light, mirroring the nuanced interplay of observation, awareness, and influence that Maya had introduced into the environment. The subtle sounds, the shuffle of papers, the faint scraping of a rolling chair, the soft click of shoes, punctuated the ambient quiet, underscoring the careful tension that hung in the air, a testament to the understated but undeniable impact of deliberate preparation and composed engagement. In that elongated pause, the space felt suspended, a moment stretched by the attentive focus of all present, the quiet authority of a young woman standing firm in her knowledge and understanding, allowing the subtle shift in perception to fully register, preparing for the moments ahead where clarity, patience, and quiet courage would continue to reshape the dynamics around her. The sudden shift in the atmosphere was almost imperceptible at first, a subtle movement at the far end of the corridor drawing all eyes toward the source. Jackson Hale appeared in the doorway, his presence commanding but measured, the polished shine of his leather shoes catching the morning light, and the tailored lines of his navy suit cutting a precise silhouette against the glass panels behind him. Officers instinctively straightened, the murmur of conversations dying immediately as his gaze swept across the room, landing directly on Maya. The young woman's posture remained unbroken, shoulders squared, eyes steady, yet a flicker of recognition passed through them, a silent acknowledgement that the unseen support she had relied on was now visible and undeniable. Jackson's voice, calm but deliberate, filled the corridor. "She has my backing now. Treat her with the respect she earns." The words hung in the air, resonating not as a command but as a clarifying force, a realignment of authority within the space that had moments ago relied solely on positional hierarchy. Sergeant Nolan's expression shifted subtly, a tightening of the jaw followed by a slight lift of the chin, signaling both acknowledgement and surprise as the weight of Jackson's presence reframed the situation. The younger officers exchanged brief, startled glances, the quiet realization settling in that the situation was no longer what it had seemed. Maya's grip on her folder remained light but firm, a deliberate display of composed readiness, and she exhaled slowly, allowing the unspoken affirmation of support to permeate her stance, reinforcing her quiet authority. The light through the windows cast elongated shadows, highlighting the angular lines of the officers' uniforms and the poised, steady frame of Maya, creating a visual contrast that underscored the subtle shift in balance. Jackson took a step forward, the soft echo of his shoes across the polished floor punctuating the silence, and his eyes met Sergeant Nolan's for a brief moment, an unspoken directive communicated with nothing more than steady regard. The officers' postures relaxed fractionally, yet the deference was undeniable, the previous certainty giving way to a measured attentiveness that recognized the legitimacy and preparedness Maya embodied. She shifted slightly, aligning herself with a subtle adjustment that reflected both awareness of her surroundings and a readiness to proceed, the tension in the air replaced by a quiet, deliberate focus that allowed clarity to emerge where confusion had momentarily prevailed. The reflective surfaces of counters and glass panels caught fragmented light, mirroring the subtle acknowledgement and recalibration of hierarchy occurring within the room, each officer absorbing the impact of the realignment without a word. Jackson's presence alone had changed the energy. The flow of authority now contained a dimension that reinforced Maya's earlier actions, validating her careful preparation and calm engagement. She allowed her gaze to pass over the room one final time, noting the subtle shifts in attention, the faint nods, the brief pauses, each an unspoken concession to accuracy, readiness, and the quiet assertion of competence. In this suspended moment, the space itself seemed to bend to the acknowledgement that knowledge, poise, and deliberate preparation could subtly reshape perception and influence outcomes, leaving the officers, the environment, and Maya in a balance that was both delicate and undeniable, a silent testament to the power of composure backed by unseen support. The tension that had filled the corridor began to dissolve into a measured calm as Jackson Hale stepped back slightly, giving space for Maya to move with quiet authority. The officers, now fully aware of the backing she had, adjusted their stances subtly, their prior skepticism tempered by recognition of the validation her support carried. Maya's shoulders remained squared, the folder still in her hands, her fingers brushing lightly over its edges as if reaffirming her composure. She exhaled slowly, letting the rhythm of her breath settle both herself and the room, the sunlight catching the subtle highlights in her hair and the polished floor reflecting the deliberate precision of her movements. Sergeant Nolan lifted a hand briefly, then let it fall, an unspoken gesture signaling acknowledgement of her insight and the legitimacy of her observations. The younger officers, some still exchanging glances, began to nod in small, careful ways, each movement a silent concession to the clarity and calm she had maintained throughout the interaction. Maya's gaze swept across the room one last time, noting the micro-expressions of realization, the slight inclinations of heads, the soft exhale from lips pressed in quiet acknowledgement, all indicating the subtle but unmistakable shift in perception. She stepped forward to place the folder gently on the counter, the motion deliberate and controlled, signaling completion of her points while maintaining poise and the quiet authority that had been established. Jackson Hale gave a subtle nod, his expression composed, a silent affirmation of her competence and the integrity she had displayed. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows illuminated the angular lines of the officers' uniforms, casting elongated shadows across the polished floors that mirrored the new alignment of respect and understanding in the room. Maya adjusted her stance slightly, the soft click of her shoes against the floor punctuating the measured rhythm of the moment, a sound that blended seamlessly with the ambient hum of computers and soft murmurs, now subdued by the acknowledgement of her presence. Her eyes moved across the space with calm assessment, noting the small shifts in posture and subtle nods, the unspoken recognition that authority and respect were now balanced differently, that her careful preparation, clarity of observation, and composed engagement had redefined the interaction without any overt confrontation. She remained still for a moment, allowing the officers to internalize the shift, the quiet strength of her presence asserting itself without a word, the sunlight reflecting on polished surfaces highlighting the contours of the room and the poised lines of her posture. Jackson Hale's gaze lingered briefly on her, the unspoken approval reinforcing the recalibration of the room, a quiet testament to the impact of competence, preparation, and integrity when exercised with patience and clarity. Maya finally exhaled a long, steady breath, the subtle movement releasing tension, the measured calm radiating outward, settling the space, and allowing the officers to process the reality that her insight and presence commanded respect, establishing a lasting impression of competence, authority, and quiet leadership that would shape the dynamics of the precinct in the moments and hours to come. The hallway grew quiet, the soft hum of the building filling the space as Maya Williams stepped toward the exit, each footfall measured, deliberate, carrying the weight of composure and quiet triumph. The sunlight through the tall windows stretched across the polished floors, illuminating the gentle angles of her silhouette and reflecting off the folders she carried, now resting lightly against her side. Officers who had moments before been skeptical now watched from a distance, their posture subtly shifted, an unspoken acknowledgement passing through glances and half-turned heads, a silent tribute to the clarity and integrity she had maintained throughout the encounter. Maya's eyes briefly scanned the corridor, taking in the faint reflections of her presence on the glass panels, the metallic edges of lockers, the soft shadows cast by the morning light, each detail grounding her as she moved with deliberate precision. She allowed herself a measured breath, feeling the rhythm of her heartbeat align with the quiet cadence of the building, the distant click of shoes, the faint shuffle of papers, all blending into a backdrop that accentuated the calm authority she exuded. Jackson Hale's presence remained a reassuring echo in her mind, the knowledge that support and validation had shifted the dynamic, giving her confidence as she navigated the final steps toward the door. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of polished floors and the subtle warmth of sunlight spilling from the windows, mingling with the faint notes of coffee from the cafeteria down the hall. Maya's shoulders remained relaxed, her posture erect, each step deliberate, the soft brush of her fingers against the folder a quiet punctuation to the careful deliberation that had guided her through the encounter. As she reached the final doorway, she paused for a moment, taking in the expanse of the hallway behind her, the subtle movements of officers acknowledging her presence without a word, the space now resonating with a tempered sense of respect and observation. She pushed the door open smoothly, the hinge whispering softly, and stepped into the sunlight outside, the city spreading before her in a canvas of movement and sound, the distant hum of traffic blending with birdsong and the rustle of trees along the sidewalk. Her gaze lifted to the sky, the pale blue of morning stretching endlessly, and she allowed herself a brief exhale, the weight of the building and the interaction settling behind her as the cool breeze brushed against her face, the sunlight highlighting the determined set of her features. Every movement, every measured breath, every glance was a testament to the quiet strength she carried, the integrity and preparation that had guided her through the hierarchy and skepticism she faced, leaving a subtle but lasting impression on the officers she passed. The city around her continued its rhythm, but the hallway she left behind seemed to carry a trace of the shift she had enacted, the silent acknowledgement of competence, patience, and composure, and Maya moved forward with steady steps, her mind clear, her focus intact, the sunlight and the cool morning air a quiet celebration of authority exercised with clarity, integrity, and unwavering resolve.